Having a sibling can be complicated. Sure, this other person is extremely important to you and you share a bond that differs from that of any other. And I think when it comes to Chevelle, that was a major part of their appeal. Three blood brothers came together and made a band. Now, we've seen that when siblings combine forces, beautiful things can happen. And we've also seen that when siblings come together, things may start out pretty great, but the music eventually suffers, or the family bond suffers, or both. Pete and Sam Loeffler formed Chevelle in 1995. If you ever wondered if they got their name from the Chevrolet Chevelle, you'd be correct. Their dad was a fan of the car and also built street rods as a hobby. In the Loeffler family, everyone had some musical talent and played piano for a few years. This was encouraged by their mom, who played guitar and sang hymns for prayer meetings. Her side of the family were really into music and different bands. With Pete on guitar and vocals and Sam on drums, they recruited their friend Matt Scott to play bass. But within the same year, Scott would leave for school and Joe Loeffler would join. Apparently, the story is that Joe found a bass guitar just lying around the house and taught himself how to play. So when Scott left, Joe joined up and was playing shows at just 14 years old. At his first show, Joe was anxious and pulled his hat over his face to hide his nervousness. But as he continued playing clubs in Illinois and later concert venues, his confidence increased. A major contributor to them playing larger crowds was the release of their debut album, Point Number 1. It was produced by Steve Albini, who had produced several Jesus Lizard albums, PJ Harvey's Rid of Me, and Nirvana's In Utero. Now, if you've ever heard Point Number 1, you'd notice that it sounds pretty low quality. Even for an album produced in 1999, it sounds somewhat hollow in parts and overblown in others. I assumed that Chevelle didn't have a big enough budget. They were on a Christian label called Squint Entertainment, which was owned by Christian rock singer Steve Taylor. Again, I made the assumption that the label hadn't backed them enough for them to put out something that sounded better. Not that the album sounded bad, but the quality was subpar. But apparently, that wasn't exactly the case because Chevelle themselves weren't pleased with how the record turned out. Joe Loeffler stated that Albini doesn't produce anything. He does everything flat notes, nothing hi-fi at all. To make matters worse, Taylor was in legal disputes with Word Records, putting Squint Entertainment in jeopardy. Chevelle wanted off the label, and they got their wish. They landed a deal with Epic Records in 2002 and recorded what is, in my opinion, one of the very best hard rock / alternative metal albums of all time. Wonder what's next. There was a guy named Alfred Adlow who developed a concept known as family constellation, where he believed that one's birth order in a family influenced the decisions one made in their life. How the child views him or herself, what they do as a career, and how they view the world can be explained by one's birth order. So, for example, the older child will take on more responsibility than the other siblings. The middle child isn't quite the leader, but isn't exactly the baby, and they may become confused as to who they really are. The youngest child could be an absolute delight, or they could be extremely entitled because they're used to being showered with love. The Loeffler household had 7 kids. I believe Sam is the oldest, or at least the oldest son. Joe isn't the youngest child, but he's 6 years younger than Sam. Pete is just 2 years younger than Sam. Because their family constellation is so populated, it isn't easy to see if these 3 sons fall into Adler's theory, but let's see if they do, shall we? When Wonder What's Next was recorded post 9/11, they obviously weren't going to recruit Steve Albini, even if they did like him as a person, and instead went with Gigi Garth, who worked on Kitty's Spit, LD50 by Mudvayne, and Rage Against the Machine's 1992 debut studio album. The record was a smash and has sold over 2 million copies. Naturally, Chevelle's star began to rise to astronomical heights. Singles as good as The Red and Send the Pain Below are naturally going to catapult you to stardom. But Closure gets a different level of respect from me. It actually got me to stop needing closure. I'm telling you, the album is essentially perfect. First time I heard Family System, I couldn't believe they had something as badass as that in their repertoire. And then to switch to something as cool and refined as Comfortable Liar was just brilliant. Don't get me wrong, Chevelle's dynamism was always there and remained a consistent part of every album they've put out, but I fell in love at first sight. Or I guess in this case, first listen. It's basically a perfect record. But if only things would remain this way. Chevelle were invited to play the second stage at Ozzfest 2002, and while Pete and Sam were able to manage the pressure of newfound fame, Joe had some problems. For starters, he was around fellow rock musicians but witnessed how drugged up and drunk they were. Also, the pressure to perform was getting to him. He became hypersensitive and exhausted. As a result, he took a temporary hiatus from Chevelle and returned home to Grayslake, Illinois, where he apparently was delivering pizzas. He really wanted to distance himself as far as possible from the limelight and the pressure. But when the road kept calling, Joe answered the call and returned to the band and his brothers. They played the main stage of Ozzfest a year later, in 2003. Less than a year after Chevelle released This Type of Thinking Could Do Us In, Sam and Pete Loeffler made this statement on Chevelle's website in 2005. After 3 years of non-stop touring and recording, Joe is taking a break to be home with family. We'll miss having him on the road with us, but as his brothers and bandmates, we respect his decision and are looking forward to getting out there and playing for the fans. Okay, naturally everyone was pretty bummed about that, but that disappointment turned into befuddlement when Joe dropped a brief expose on his brothers. First off, very typical. This is exactly what I expected from them. Try and make it look like I didn't want to be in the band. I was fired, plain and simple. In fact, there wasn't even a discussion about it, they just dropped it on me. I told them I would never quit and they would have to fire me. They were trying to get me to quit and told my managers that I did. I called Sam and said, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "We don't want you to come back." I said, "I will not quit." The next day, Pete called for the first time and said, "Did our managers call you and tell you you're out?" I said, "No, were they supposed to?" He eventually said in that short conversation, "You're fired." I'm insulted by the message on the front page of the site. By the way, that's the first change to the site I've seen in at least a year. It is completely false and out of line. I made no decision and I am not taking a break. I will be working on getting a new job immediately. A break also means there's a chance to come back, and nothing could be farther from reality. I was fired, and they have not said a word to me since. I would never ask to be back in. Why would I want to after this? And I never did in the past when I quit. We'll miss having him on the road with us. Right. I was able to pull the quotes from Ultimate Guitar, and when you read the comments, there's an outpouring of support for Joe. A lot of hate for Pete and Sam, but overall disappointment that it had to go down this way. Some even said that Joe's playing was a signature part of the band, and without him, the band would struggle. Regardless, Chevelle recruited former Filter guitarist Gina Leonardo to be temporary bassist for their upcoming shows. And about a year later, MTV caught up with Pete and asked him about the situation with Joe, and he reiterated that Joe was the one who decided to quit. But it was more than just that. He said, "People need to know that he quit many times before, and that time he quit as well. He took a train home from Kansas City, Missouri, and the band flew home. And when we did get home, it was the same old thing. Joe quit again. When he was confronted on it, he denied it, and we said, well, too bad, because now it's really over." You can only do that so many times, and you can only treat people like shit so many times before you have to deal with those consequences. So the bad blood was so bad that the band even had to cover it up on stage. Pete continued, "We were always covering it up on stage. As soon as we got off stage, he would go off and do his own thing. There were times where you didn't speak for a long time, and you'd still get on stage every night and play. I don't think he liked the lifestyle. the work side of it, the real side of it. If you're unfamiliar with the story, that last point may have struck a nerve with you. You might be asking, what did Pete mean when he said Joe didn't like the work side of it? Well, Sam answered that by saying, he never wrote anything. He would only show up to the studio and have to learn it right there. I've always written everything and I have always brought it to the band and we go over what we think is good. He really wasn't a part of that. He was more like a touring partner. I know they're Christians or were Christians, which is a topic for another day, but Jesus fucking Christ, man. This was unbelievable the first time I read this, but then you think about the people who said that Joe's bass game would be missed. Would it? As a matter of fact, some people still say that Chevelle hasn't been the same since Joe and his contributions on bass left the scene. Well, the guy who was actually writing the bass lines has been there all along, so I mean, it's a little embarrassing. Anyway, Pete said that he wished that they all could be brothers and friends again. I've tried to find any shred of evidence that that wish came true, but I haven't found anything. Neither Pete nor Sam post him on their Instagram accounts, and Joe's account is private. Moreover, in an interview with Loudwire, Pete had this to say about Joe. We literally have not spoken to him since he said, "You're going to hear from my lawyer, so he can kiss my ass." Joe had joined forces with Marcus Curiel, who at the time was kicked out of POD, and Dave Buckner, who left Papa Roach to, quote, clean his act up, as Papa Roach frontman Jacoby Shaddix put it. They were fronted by Lucas Rossi, the winner of the reality TV show Rockstar Supernova. Unfortunately, Rossi left the band shortly after joining it. Curiel would rejoin POD a few years after being kicked out, and then Rossi and Buckner would link with former Evanescence guitarist Ben Moody and former In This Moment bassist John Newell to form the Halo Method. I have no idea what Joe does now. If you know, please enlighten me. Despite losing brother Joe Loeffler as a bandmate and as a friend, Chevelle remained a band of brothers when they hired Dean Bernardini, their brother-in-law, who was an old friend and fellow musician in the Chicago scene. His first album with Chevelle would be Venacero, which featured the single Well Enough Alone. Now, it's been suggested that this song is about Joe, but I haven't found any evidence that this is true. Okay, well, other than the lyrics, I have found no evidence to suggest that this assertion is true. Okay, so some lyrics that stand out are, "Hint to no one that this generic bond exists, evil shows another side. So fed up, what's with the scenes? Observe and leave instead. This pity wagon penetrates my skin, so sensitive it makes me sick." Then there's the pre-chorus that goes, "And like before, makes no sense. Never coming, always leaving, right before. Hooked on substance, digging deeper, can't reveal why we leave well enough alone." Okay, let's be honest. Without a band member to confirm this, we really can't know that this song is about Joe. But there are some choice lines that lead one to wonder, I must admit. However, when Pete sings right before Hooked on Substance, are we to assume that Joe became the very drugged up drunkard he loathed in other rock stars? If this is true, that's quite the bombshell but also highly disappointing. In my opinion, this line throws the entire notion that the song is about Joe into question. That's a huge line and there's no proof that he abused substances. But again, if you know something I don't, please let me know. I've seen Sam show off his liquor cabinet and I believe Pete is a fan of booze too, but it's never gotten in the way of the music. Chevelle even partnered with Revolution Brewing to create their own lager called La Gargola, also known as their most critically acclaimed album, even though it's not as good as Wonder What's Next, but hey, it's pretty decent, not gonna lie. At this point, Dean was a mainstay in Chevelle and his woodwork was the cover art for Sci-Fi Crimes as well as Straight Arrows, a collection of favorites. But the three would go back to two when Dean announced the following in September 2019. To all my dedicated fans and friends, it is with a heavy heart that I have decided I will be taking a break from the road to spend some much needed time at home with my family. I consider myself lucky to have been a part of Chevelle and have shared the stage with such incredible musicians. These past 15 years and 6 albums have been amazing to be a part of. I will continue to work on my passion of music in some form or another and continue to put time into my art and furniture business at home. Now, does this sound like he's taking a break from Chevelle or that he left Chevelle? Sounds like he left Chevelle to me. But with the Heineken virus, maybe all that time spent at home will energize him to rejoin? Dean has been a part of Chevelle for longer than Joe, and fans will miss him. So I guess we'll wait and see. Or maybe the Loefflers have another brother or brother-in-law interested in being a rock star. So, did we see the concept of family constellation explain this family's system? To be honest, not exactly. Sam seems to be the eldest kid or among the oldest. It was said that once the oldest kid loses their parents' attention, they become the problem child, and I don't see any evidence that he felt responsible for his siblings. He seems like an okay brother to me. Pete seems to be among the oldest kids, or perhaps the second born kid or the second born son. These kids are ultra competitive, the second born kids, and are pretty rebellious against what is expected of them. As you may or may not know, Pete left his faith, and if his parents are anything like mine, they didn't like that very much. But Pete doesn't seem very competitive. And lastly, Joe being a middle kid and the youngest in the trio, based on Adler's theory, he's supposed to be predisposed to being the child who is often playing the victim, is easily angered, and very sensitive. Yikes. You know what? I'll let Pete have the final words on this. It was a pretty negative, harsh thing, but the reality is we never had a good relationship. You just have those people in your family or in your life that you just never really got along with. He never got along with us. Family dynamics can be really hard, and as they say, every family has one, and if you don't know who it is, it's probably you. Thanks for watching.